in the land of Israel. During the time of the judges, the hills of Bethlehem glimmered beneath the sun, surrounded by vineyards and olive trees, the sound of sheep bells ringing through the valleys. In those days, there lived a man named Elimelech, whose house stood among the fields, simple but filled with the laughter of family. Elimelech was a provider, sturdy and practical, devoted to his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Life in Bethlehem moved with the seasons, plowing, sowing, harvesting. The village was alive with the scent of bread baking, children's voices, the distant call of shepherds. Naomi was known for her warmth and grace. She greeted her neighbors at the well, sang songs as she worked, and told her boys stories of their people's history, the crossing of the Red Sea, the walls of Jericho, the faith of Abraham. Yet as the years passed, the rain stopped falling, the sky remained cloudless, crops withered, and the wells sank lower with every week. Fields that once shone with golden grain now lay brown and empty. Hunger pressed upon the village. Elimelech saw the lines deepening on Naomi's face, the worry in her eyes. Families around them began to leave, searching for food in other lands. One evening, as dusk colored the sky, Elimelech sat by the fire with Naomi and their sons. His voice was heavy. "We cannot survive here any longer," he said. "We must go to Moab. I have heard there is bread in that land." Naomi's heart trembled. Moab was foreign, a land with strange customs and gods. But she nodded, her loyalty stronger than her fear. Early the next morning, they gathered their few belongings, wrapped in cloth, and left the home of their ancestors behind. The journey to Moab took many days. They traveled across hills and valleys, slept beneath olive trees, and followed the riverbanks where the reeds whispered in the night breeze. Mahlon and Chilion, once restless boys, grew quiet with fatigue and uncertainty. Naomi kept their spirits up with gentle songs, but her own heart ached with every step away from Bethlehem. Arriving in Moab, they settled on the edge of a small town. The people there spoke a language Elimelech barely understood, and the market bustled with unfamiliar sights and smells. Still, Elimelech found work harvesting barley. Naomi traded her bread and cheese, and the family made a humble home among strangers. Over the next years, their lives grew roots in Moab. Mahlon and Chilion became young men, their Hebrew accented with the words of Moabite neighbors. When they were old enough, each took a wife from among the local women. Mahlon married Ruth, whose eyes were dark and kind, while Chilion married Orpah, cheerful and quick with laughter. Naomi taught her daughters-in-law how to knead dough, how to recite the prayers of Israel, and slowly she began to find comfort in her new family. But peace was not to last. One winter, a fever swept through the town. Elimelech grew weak, his voice fading to a whisper. Naomi held his hand as he slipped away, her heart breaking as she buried him beneath a young olive tree outside the village. The sons grieved, but life continued. Ruth and Orpah became daughters to Naomi, sharing her burdens, brightening her days with their company. Tragedy struck again. Mahlon and Chilion both fell ill. No healer could save them. Naomi wept as she buried her sons side by side, the weight of grief nearly crushing her. She was left alone, an exile in a foreign land, her family reduced to memories and empty rooms. Ruth and Orpah, too, were widowed young, bound to Naomi, not only by marriage, but by the depth of loss they shared. As weeks passed, Naomi heard rumors from passing travelers that the famine in Israel had ended. The Lord had visited his people and given them bread once more. Something stirred in Naomi, an ache for home, for the hills of Bethlehem, for the familiar comfort of her people. She decided she must return. Ruth and Orpah gathered their few belongings, prepared to follow her, for neither wanted to abandon the only family they had left. As the three women walked the road out of Moab, Naomi stopped. She turned to her daughters-in-law, her voice gentle but firm. "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown to me and to the dead. May you find rest, each of you, in the home of another husband." Orpah and Ruth wept, refusing to leave her. But Naomi insisted, "Return, my daughters. Why come with me? Am I able to give you more sons, that you may marry again? No, my daughters, my life is too bitter for you. The Lord's hand has gone out against me." The road stretched empty behind them. Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye, tears streaming down her cheeks, and walked slowly back toward Moab, glancing back until she vanished from sight. But Ruth clung to Naomi, her arms tight. Naomi tried once more to persuade her. "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." Ruth shook her head. Her voice was low but unwavering. "Do not urge me to leave you, or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Naomi looked into Ruth's eyes, saw the determination and love, and relented. Together they continued the long journey to Bethlehem, carrying only what they could hold and the burdens of their hearts. Bethlehem was alive with the sounds of harvest when they arrived. The women of the town gathered around, whispering, "Can this be Naomi?" She answered them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." The townsfolk watched with compassion as Naomi and Ruth settled into a small home on the edge of the village. They had nothing, no land, no source of income, no men to provide for them, but it was the beginning of barley harvest. Ruth, determined to support Naomi, asked permission to go to the fields and glean among the sheaves after the harvesters. It was the custom in Israel that the poor and the foreigner could gather what was left behind by the workers, a law of mercy and justice. Early in the morning, Ruth wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and set out. The fields spread wide beneath the blue sky, the barley swaying in the breeze. She kept her eyes down, working diligently, hoping to gather enough to feed Naomi for the day. The reapers glanced at her, some curious, some wary. She was a stranger, unfamiliar. By providence, Ruth found herself gleaning in the field of Boaz, a wealthy and respected man, a relative of Elimelech. Boaz arrived to greet his workers, his presence calm and commanding. "The Lord be with you," he said, and they answered, "The Lord bless you." Noticing the young woman, Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that young woman?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi. She has worked from morning until now, with barely a moment's rest." Boaz approached Ruth, speaking kindly. "Listen to me, my daughter. Do not go and glean in another field, and do not leave this one, but stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the jars the men have filled." Ruth bowed low, surprised by his generosity. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you should notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz smiled. "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." At mealtime, Boaz invited Ruth to join his workers. She sat with them, eating roasted grain and dipping bread into vinegar. Boaz offered her more than she could eat, and when she returned to glean, he instructed his workers, "Let her gather among the sheaves, and do not rebuke her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to pick up, and do not reprimand her." Ruth worked until evening, then threshed what she had gathered, about an ephah of barley, enough for days. She carried it back to Naomi, who was astonished at the abundance. Ruth told her everything that had happened. Naomi, recognizing the name of Boaz, exclaimed, "The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's fields throughout the barley and wheat harvests, always bringing home what she had gathered, always welcomed by Naomi with relief and gratitude. As harvest ended, Naomi's thoughts turned to Ruth's future. She knew Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, a man who could, according to Israelite custom, redeem the land of Elimelech and take Ruth as his wife, restoring the family's name. One evening, Naomi spoke to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you, where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours?" She instructed Ruth to wash, put on her best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor, where Boaz would be winnowing barley. Naomi told her to wait until he had finished eating and drinking, then to go and uncover his feet and lie down. "He will tell you what to do." Ruth replied, "I will do whatever you say." She went down to the threshing floor, doing as Naomi instructed. After Boaz had finished his meal, he lay down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, Boaz awoke, startled to find a woman at his feet. "Who are you?" he whispered. "I am your servant Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." Boaz answered, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." She lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. Boaz gave her 6 measures of barley, sending her back to Naomi. Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Ruth recounted everything. Naomi smiled. "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." At sunrise, Boaz went up to the city gate of Bethlehem. The gate was the place where the elders gathered, where legal matters and business were settled. He sat down and called aside the nearer kinsman redeemer, a relative of Elimelech's family, and also invited 10 elders of the town to sit with them as witnesses. As morning light filtered over the rooftops and the market began to stir, Villagers paused to watch the gathering. Boaz addressed the relative plainly. Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it, except you. And I am next in line. The man nodded, considering the proposal. I will redeem it, he answered, perhaps seeing only the value of land, thinking of his estate. But Boaz continued, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the dead man, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. The relative hesitated. Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. According to custom in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. It was a sign of confirmation in Israel. The man removed his sandal and handed it to Boaz in front of the witnesses, and all who stood at the gate watched as Boaz accepted the responsibility. Boaz turned to the elders and all the people present. Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. The elders replied, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. The matter settled, Boaz went home and prepared for his wedding. The people of Bethlehem rejoiced. They decorated the streets with flowers, baked bread and cakes, and filled the air with music and song. Ruth, now freed from uncertainty, was grateful for Boaz's integrity and for Naomi's wisdom. The wedding itself was simple but joyful, attended by neighbors and friends, with Naomi standing close by, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes. For the first time in many years, Naomi felt her sorrow lifting. She was surrounded by the love of Ruth, kindness of Boaz, and the acceptance of her people. Ruth, now a wife, settled into her new life. She managed the household with skill and grace, learning the traditions of Israel and blending them with memories from her Moabite home. Seasons passed. Fields turned from green to gold, and Ruth's belly grew round with child. Naomi was often by her side, preparing special foods, telling stories, and offering guidance. The house filled with anticipation. Boaz watched Ruth with affection and pride, quietly giving thanks for the fortune that had come from what once seemed only loss and sorrow. In time, Ruth gave birth to a son. The midwife laid the baby in Naomi's arms, and she held him close, weeping with joy. The women of Bethlehem gathered, singing songs of praise, saying, Naomi has a son. They named the child Obed. He would grow to be the father of Jesse, and Jesse would become the father of David, who would one day be Israel's greatest king. Naomi's days, once dark and bitter, were now filled with laughter and light. She cared for Obed as if he were her own, teaching him the prayers and songs of her people, watching him take his first steps on the earthen floor of their home. Ruth and Boaz worked together, tending fields, raising their son, and sharing the responsibilities and joys of family life. The story of Ruth, the Moabite woman who left her home and everything familiar, who remained loyal to her mother-in-law in the face of despair, became a cherished tale throughout Bethlehem. Elders would recount her courage and kindness to children gathered at their feet. Mothers would remind their daughters of Ruth's patience and faithfulness. Boaz's fairness and compassion became a model for other men in the village. As Obed grew, the family's prosperity increased. Their fields yielded abundant harvests. The house was often filled with visitors, travelers, relatives, the poor and the orphaned, each welcomed with a meal and a place to sleep. Ruth remembered what it felt like to be an outsider, and she made certain that all who entered her home felt the warmth and safety she had found. The years turned. Obed became a strong, clever boy, helping Boaz with the sheep, and learning from Ruth how to care for others. Naomi, now elderly, watched with pride as her family flourished, her own story now woven with Ruth's into a tapestry of blessing and redemption. Obed grew to be a young man and married a woman from Bethlehem. He too would have a son, Jesse. Naomi, if she lived to see him, would have smiled at how life continued, how each generation built upon the faith and courage of those who came before. Jesse in his time became a respected leader in Bethlehem. He had many sons, the youngest of whom was David. David would tend his father's sheep in the fields outside Bethlehem, composing psalms beneath the open sky, learning to be brave and gentle, just as Ruth and Boaz had been. One day David would be called by God to become king, and the story of Ruth, her loyalty, her courage, her journey from loss to abundance, would be remembered as the root of a legacy that changed a nation. Even as the generations passed, the villagers spoke with reverence of Ruth, the Moabite, who became mother to kings. Her name was remembered at weddings and feasts, spoken in blessing over newborns, taught to children as an example of steadfast love and noble character. As Boaz and Ruth grew old together, their days slowed, filled with the simple joys of family, the peace of fulfilled hopes. Boaz would sit outside in the cool of the evening, watching Obed's children play in the dust, remembering the first time he saw Ruth gleaning in his fields. Ruth, her hair now streaked with gray, would work quietly in the kitchen, singing songs in both Hebrew and the tongue of her childhood. The family's house, built of stone and timber, stood sturdy among the fields, a testament to faith, resilience, and love. The house of Boaz and Ruth became a place where the lost found welcome, where the hungry were fed, where stories were told and retold as night settled over the hills of Bethlehem. Naomi's spirit, so long crushed by grief, had found healing in the laughter of grandchildren, in the harvest brought in each year, in the love that filled her days until her life drew to a gentle close. When at last Naomi passed, she was mourned by the whole village, her life celebrated with songs and memories, her name spoken with honor and affection. Ruth and Boaz buried her with the family, among the olive trees on the hillside, knowing that her journey, filled with both suffering and joy, had left a mark on generations to come. Ruth lived to see her children and grandchildren thrive. She watched Obed's family grow, saw Jesse's sons running through the fields, heard news of David's birth and his early promise. When at last Ruth's days came to an end, she was mourned not only by her family, but by all of Bethlehem, remembered not as a foreigner, but as a mother of Israel, the great-grandmother of a king. Her story of loss and courage, of faith and love, became a song for the ages. In time, the story of Ruth reached beyond the hills of Bethlehem, told in the courts of kings, recited by poets and prophets, cherished by all who believed that steadfast love and faithful action could change the course of history. From Ruth's lineage, generations later, would come the Messiah, Jesus, born in Bethlehem, descendant of David. The promise given to Abraham and carried through Naomi, Ruth, Boaz, and their descendants would echo through time, that through their family all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And so, in the quiet heart of Israel, in a simple home among the barley fields, a story began, a story of kindness, redemption, and hope, woven forever into the tapestry of God's people. As Obed grew from a boy to a young man, the house of Boaz and Ruth became a place of constant life and motion. The days were filled with the sound of footsteps on the stone floor, the laughter of children echoing through the halls, and the gentle murmur of voices as the family gathered for meals. Obed, curious and quick-witted, learned the ways of the fields from Boaz. In the early dawn, father and son would walk the perimeter of their land, inspecting fences, checking on the sheep, and pausing to watch the golden light spill over the distant hills. Ruth took great care in her duties at home. She baked bread every morning, the aroma drifting through the courtyard and drawing neighbors and family alike. She tended to the garden, nurturing rows of beans, cucumbers and herbs, her hands gentle and skilled as she worked the earth. Ruth took pride in her work and taught Obed the value of persistence and care in even the smallest task. In the evenings, the family would gather in the main room. Boaz would tell stories of his youth, of past harvests, and of the long line of ancestors who had called Bethlehem home. Ruth shared tales of Moab, describing the wide river banks and the songs she remembered from her childhood. Naomi, her hair now white as new wool, sat close by, her eyes twinkling as she watched the new generation blossom before her. When Obed was old enough, he learned to read and write from a traveling scribe who spent a season in Bethlehem. Ruth believed in learning and encouraged Obed's curiosity. He would return home with stories written on scraps of parchment, eager to show his mother the new letters he had mastered. Boaz watched with pride as his son grew not only in strength, but in wisdom, blending the hardiness of a farmer with the mind of a scholar. The seasons cycled with reassuring regularity. Spring brought new lambs and the promise of abundant crops. The family celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread, with neighbors and extended relatives, sharing laughter and song late into the night. Summer was a time for gathering, grapes for wine, olives for oil, and wheat for bread. Ruth organized these labors, making sure nothing went to waste, and every year she set aside a portion for the poor, remembering her own days of hunger and want. In autumn, as the air cooled and leaves turned golden, the village prepared for the Feast of Booth. Ruth and Boaz built a shelter of branches in their courtyard, and the family slept outside beneath the stars, recalling the journey of their ancestors through the wilderness. Obed listened in wonder as Naomi told him stories of Moses, Aaron, and the miracles that had brought the Israelites to the Promised Land. Winter was a season of closeness. The family spent evenings gathered around the fire, mending clothes, repairing tools, and telling stories. Ruth wove blankets of wool sheared from their own sheep, and Boaz carved small wooden toys for the children. Naomi taught her grandson old songs, her voice quavering but strong with emotion. As years passed, Obed became a respected young man in Bethlehem. He married a kind woman named Deborah, the daughter of a neighbor, and brought her into the family home. Deborah learned from Ruth the ways of keeping a house and garden, and together the women filled the house with the sights and smells of fresh bread, dried herbs,
and cut flowers from the hillside. Obed's first son Jesse was born on a spring morning when the hills were covered in wildflowers. Ruth wept with joy as she held her grandson for the first time, feeling the circle of her life complete. Boaz rejoiced and offered sacrifices of thanksgiving at the sanctuary, his heart full of pride and humility. Naomi, frail but delighted, sang blessings over the newborn, her voice trembling with happiness. The family continued to prosper. Boaz and Obed worked together to expand their herds, improve their irrigation, and develop new methods for protecting their crops from pests and drought. Ruth's careful stewardship ensured that every corner of the home and land thrived. Neighbors often came to her for advice, and young women asked for her help with their first gardens or their new marriages. Jesse grew up surrounded by love and tradition. He learned to walk by clinging to his grandmother Ruth's skirts, followed Boaz into the fields with chubby legs, and listened to Obed's lessons at the fireside. He had many brothers and sisters, each one welcomed into the world with the same joy and reverence that had greeted his own birth.
As the years turned, Ruth's story became more than just a tale for the family. It became an example for the whole community of Bethlehem. Neighbors remembered her generosity and her willingness to work, and the elders pointed to her as a model of virtue and faithfulness. When disputes arose, people often asked, "What would Ruth have done?" And the answer, more often than not, brought peace. David was still young when Samuel, the prophet of Israel, came to Bethlehem. The old man's arrival caused a stir. The elders greeted him with respect, and a little fear, for Samuel's word was law throughout the land. Samuel asked Jesse to bring his sons before him, for the Lord had sent him to anoint a new king for Israel. One by one, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel. Each was tall, strong, and impressive in his own way. But as each stood before the prophet, Samuel shook his head. At last, with only David remaining, Jesse called for his youngest son, who was tending sheep in the hills. David arrived, sunburnt and breathless, harp still slung over his shoulder. As David stood before Samuel, the prophet smiled. The Lord spoke to Samuel's heart, saying, "This is the one." Samuel took oil and poured it over David's head, anointing him in the presence of his family. The Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward, and the future king's journey began. Though Ruth did not live to see her great-grandson anointed, her story was present in that moment. The courage that had brought her to Bethlehem, the love that had sustained her through loss, the legacy of faith and kindness that had shaped David's character. Her choices rippled outward, changing not just her own destiny, but that of a nation. David's path would be long and difficult. He would serve King Saul, fight Goliath, and eventually become the ruler of Israel. But through all his victories and failures, the memory of Ruth endured. He remembered the lessons of loyalty, humility, and hope that she had passed down through the generations. Bethlehem, once a small village on the edge of the wilderness, became famous as the city of David, known throughout Israel as the birthplace of the king. Pilgrims and poets would visit the place where Ruth had once gleaned, marveling at the way a foreigner's faith had become the root of Israel's glory. The house of Jesse flourished. David's brothers and sisters raised families of their own, each passing down the stories and traditions that began with Ruth and Boaz. The fields Ruth once walked as a gleaner were now the source of prosperity for hundreds. The barley and wheat, the olive groves and vineyards, fed not only Jesse's family, but much of Bethlehem. In time, David's own children would run through the same fields, climb the same olive trees, and learn the same songs. The house was filled with laughter, music, and the endless bustle of life, just as it had been when Ruth first arrived so many years before. The memory of Ruth, the Moabite woman who had come to Bethlehem out of love, was kept alive not only in story, but in every act of kindness, every song sung, every meal shared, and every prayer whispered in the quiet of the evening. As David grew into a young man, his reputation in Bethlehem and beyond only increased. The songs he composed while tending his father's sheep became known among the shepherds of the region, and even travelers from distant towns would repeat the melodies they learned near Jesse's fields. David's brothers looked on with a mix of pride and exasperation, for while they valued his gifts, they could not have imagined how far his path would take him. The family home, once the humble dwelling Ruth had first entered as a widow, was now a sprawling compound at the edge of the village, its walls thick with the history of generations. Jesse and his sons maintained the fields, now expanded far beyond what Boaz and Ruth had ever known. The prosperity of the household became a model for other families. The work ethic, generosity and justice that Boaz had instilled in his sons and grandsons shaped the entire community. The fields of Bethlehem remained central to daily life. Each year the rhythms of sowing and reaping brought the family together. During harvest, the house would overflow with relatives, friends, and laborers, all sharing in the bounty. Great baskets of barley and wheat filled the storage rooms, while Ruth's garden continued to flourish under the care of her granddaughters. Herbs hung from the rafters, beans and cucumbers filled earthen jars, and the scents of rosemary, mint, and thyme perfumed the air. Inside the house, family meals were occasions of celebration and remembrance. The elders at the table would tell stories of Ruth and Boaz, of Naomi's courage, and of the faith that had brought their ancestors safely through famine and sorrow. The youngest children would listen in awe as tales of Ruth's first days in Bethlehem were recounted, the loneliness, the toil in the fields, the unlikely kindness of Boaz, and the turning point that had changed the course of their family's destiny. Obed, now an old man, often sat with his grandchildren, recalling with clarity the gentle strength of his mother Ruth. He spoke of her careful hands, her determination in the face of hardship, and her unbreakable devotion to Naomi. She never forgot where she came from, he would say. She was a stranger here once, but she made this place home for all of us. David, whose curiosity and energy set him apart, absorbed these stories. He felt a deep kinship with Ruth, though she had passed before he was born. In quiet moments, he would walk the same fields she had once gleaned, running his fingers through the barley, and picturing the days when his great-grandmother had gathered grain with her own hands. He imagined the courage it took to leave everything behind and build a new life from the ashes of grief. Bethlehem itself grew and changed, but the name of Ruth endured. At village gatherings and seasonal festivals, her memory was honored in song and story. Young brides were reminded of her example. Travelers were told the tale of the Moabite woman who had become a pillar of Israel. Ruth's grave beside Boaz's became a place of quiet pilgrimage, a spot where people left flowers or small tokens, seeking blessing for their own journeys. Jesse's sons each found their own paths. Eliab married and took on responsibilities in the community. Abinadab expanded the family's herds, and Shammah became known for his wisdom in settling disputes. The younger brothers followed, each contributing to the family's name and fortune, while David continued to find solace among the hills and valleys, always with his harp and a sling at his side. In those days,
News from outside Bethlehem often arrived with merchants or travelers passing through. Tales of King Saul's victories and failures, of battles with the Philistines, and of prophets and miracles, all stirred the imagination of the people. The family gathered at the gate each evening to hear the latest stories and to wonder what role, if any, they might play in the fate of Israel. As David's fame grew, so did the pride of his family. Yet they remained grounded in the traditions Ruth and Boaz had established. The household was known for its hospitality, welcoming the poor, the traveler, and the orphan. Meals were shared with neighbors and strangers alike, and the values of kindness, honesty, and humility were honored above all. David's heart was shaped by these lessons. When he was called to play music for King Saul, he left home with his father's blessing and the knowledge that he carried his family's hopes and prayers with him. He never forgot the fields of Bethlehem, nor the stories of Ruth and Boaz that had guided him since childhood. In time, David's journey would take him far from home. He would face giants, flee from enemies, lead armies, and eventually become the king of Israel. Yet even as he sat upon the throne in Jerusalem, he remembered the simple faith and courage of his great-grandmother Ruth, the foreigner, who had become the mother of kings. The story of Ruth did not end with her passing. It lived on in her descendants, in the land she had come to call home, and in the hearts of all who believed in the power of love, loyalty, and redemption. Generations passed, and the house of Jesse remained a beacon of hope and stability in Bethlehem. The values that Ruth and Boaz had embodied were passed from father to son, mother to daughter. The fields were still worked with care, the harvests celebrated with gratitude, and the stories retold each season as new children were born into the family. As centuries rolled by, pilgrims continued to visit the graves of Ruth and Boaz. They marveled at how a single act of loyalty had changed the fate of a family, a village, and a nation. The children of Bethlehem, now grown, and with children of their own, continued to honor the memory of the woman who had arrived as a stranger and left as a mother of Israel. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun set over the hills and the fields glowed with golden light, Jesse's descendants would gather in the courtyard. They spoke of Ruth's journey, of Naomi's strength, of Boaz's kindness, and of the unbroken chain that connected their family to the promise of something greater yet to come.
And so the story continued, woven into the tapestry of Israel's history, a testament to the enduring power of love and the legacy of one woman's courage, faith, and devotion. Jesse inherited his father's curiosity and his mother's resilience. Ruth saw her own story in his eyes, the courage to start anew, the strength to persist through difficulty, and the wisdom to cherish family above all else. She told Jesse the story of how she left Moab, not to frighten him but to remind him that love and faith can bridge any distance. As Jesse reached manhood, he became known for his fairness and compassion. He was quick to help a neighbor in need and always willing to share the bounty of the family fields. Ruth watched him, proud and a little wistful, remembering her own journey from a young widow in a foreign land to the matriarch of a thriving clan. The years slipped by, marked by the regular rhythms of planting and harvest, birth and marriage, sorrow and celebration. The house of Ruth and Boaz became the heart of a growing family, their courtyard filled with grandchildren, the walls lined with generations of memories. Naomi in her final years was cared for by all, her stories passing into the hearts of each new child born into the family. When at last Naomi died, she was mourned by the entire village. Ruth, Obed, Boaz, and Jesse buried her among the olive trees, just as they had buried Elimelech, Melern, and Chilion so many years before. Her grave was marked with stones and flowers, a place for remembrance and quiet gratitude. After Naomi's passing, Ruth leaned even more on the strength of her family. She became the anchor for Jesse's children, teaching them to bake bread, to mend clothes, to plant seeds and watch them grow. Boaz continued to guide the family with wisdom and patience, and together they watched their family multiply and thrive. Jesse grew to manhood, and, like his father and grandfather, became a pillar of the Bethlehem community. He married and had 8 sons, each one adding new life and energy to the house of Ruth and Boaz. The youngest of Jesse's sons was David, born on a night filled with rain, his first cries strong and insistent. David was a different kind of child, restless, musical, and thoughtful. As a boy, he wandered the hills with his father's sheep, carrying a harp and singing songs to the sky. Ruth, now an old woman, saw something special in him. She told him stories of her journey from Moab, of the courage it took to leave everything behind, and the blessing that followed those who live with love and loyalty. David listened, absorbing her words. The bond between great-grandmother and great-grandson was unique. Ruth saw in David a spirit that would shape history, though she could not have imagined the destiny awaiting him. When Boaz passed away, he was mourned deeply by his family and neighbors. His sons and grandsons bore his coffin through the fields he had tended, laying him to rest beside Naomi and the ancestors who had made Bethlehem their home. Ruth lived a few years longer, cherished by her children and grandchildren, respected by all who knew her story. When Ruth died, her family and the whole community gathered to honor her. They remembered the young widow who had left Moab for love, who had worked the fields as a stranger, who had raised sons and grandsons with gentleness and courage. Her grave next to Boaz became a place where generations came to give thanks for the legacy of faith, hope, and love she left behind. Jesse's sons grew strong, each with their own path. The youngest, David, would one day be called by the prophet Samuel, anointed as king while still a boy tending sheep. David would sing the songs Ruth had sung to him, remember her stories of courage and faith, and lead his people with the same heart of loyalty and justice she had shown. David's victories and struggles would echo the lessons learned in the house of Ruth and Boaz. He would unite the tribes of Israel, write psalms that would endure for millennia, and become the ancestor of a greater king who would be born in Bethlehem centuries later. The story of Ruth, once a tale of loss and displacement, became the foundation of a royal lineage. Her faithfulness changed the fate of her family, her people, and ultimately, the world. And so, in the annals of Israel, Ruth's name is remembered with honor. The book written in her memory is not only a record of her life, but a tribute to the power of love and devotion, a story for all generations. David grew up amidst the olive groves and barley fields of Bethlehem, his laughter as bright as the sunlight on ripening wheat. As a child, he spent long days with the sheep, following them across the green hills, singing songs his father Jesse taught him, songs Jesse had learned from Obed, and that Obed had learned from Ruth. The melodies were old and full of longing, some in the language of Israel, some with notes and turns that Ruth herself had brought from Moab. Jesse's house, once the humble dwelling of Ruth and Boaz, had grown larger over the years. There were now separate rooms for each of the sons, and the central courtyard bustled with activity from morning until night. Deborah, Jesse's mother, ruled the kitchen, preparing great pots of stew and baking endless rounds of bread. Ruth's old garden still thrived, now tended by her granddaughters, who carried on her traditions of planting by the cycles of the moon and gathering herbs before dawn. David was different from his brothers. While Eliab, Abinadab and Shammah were strong and serious, David was curious and quick. He would often slip away from chores to wander the streambeds, collecting smooth stones or watching dragonflies skim over the water. He was quick to smile and quicker to forgive, always ready with a story, a joke, or a song. The people of Bethlehem came to know David as the youngest and most surprising of Jesse's sons. He was never too proud to help carry water from the well or to sweep the dust from the doorstep. When strangers visited, he would greet them with a grin and offer whatever food was at hand, remembering the hospitality that Ruth had shown to all who passed her door. On festival days, Jesse's family hosted relatives and friends from all over the region. The men gathered in the courtyard, sharing news of the harvest and debating the affairs of Israel. The women, young and old, braided each other's hair and laughed as they prepared the feast. Children ran through the house, playing games beneath the fig trees and darting between the adults. During these gatherings, stories of Ruth and Boaz were retold. Naomi's wisdom, Ruth's loyalty, and Boaz's kindness were the themes of endless conversations, and the younger children would listen, wide-eyed, to tales of the journey from Moab, the long days in the fields, and the providence that had brought Ruth to Bethlehem. These stories were woven into the fabric of the family's identity, treasured and retold as both history and inheritance. As David grew, he became more involved in the daily work of the family. He helped tend the sheep, learned to play the harp, and memorized the stories of his ancestors. He was fascinated by tales of Ruth's courage, how she had left everything for love, how she had worked with her hands, how she had become the foundation for all that had come after her. Ruth's influence remained strong, even after her passing. Her memory lingered in the rituals of daily life, in the way Jesse blessed the bread, in the songs the family sang at dawn and dusk, in the careful stewardship of the land she had once worked as a gleaner. The garden was her legacy, blooming each spring with flowers and vegetables, a living reminder of her ability to create abundance from little. David's own character reflected the lessons learned from Ruth. He was compassionate to the weak, generous to the stranger, and steadfastly loyal to his family. When a neighbor's sheep were lost, he searched for them as if they were his own. When the poor came to Jesse's gate, David gave them bread, and sometimes his own portion. The elders of Bethlehem saw something special in the boy, a blend of courage and humility that set him apart. As the family prospered, Jesse expanded their holdings. More fields were added to the estate, new vineyards planted, and the house repaired and enlarged to make room for future generations. Obed, now an old man, would sit in the shade and watch his grandsons at play, his eyes full of pride and wonder. Sometimes he would call David to his side and recount the story of Ruth one more time, making sure that the details would not be forgotten. David's brothers took on responsibilities in the community. Eliab became a leader among the men, helping settle disputes and organize labor for the harvest. Abinadab managed the livestock, breeding sheep and goats known throughout the region for their strength and health. Shammah tended the vineyards, perfecting the art of winemaking that Boaz had begun years before. David, meanwhile, continued to care for the sheep, finding peace in the solitude of the hills. He composed songs as he watched the flocks, lyrics that spoke of the beauty of the land, the kindness of God, and the unbroken thread that ran through his family's history. His voice, pure and clear,
echoed over the fields at sunset, and travelers passing by would pause, drawn by the sound. Jesse's household was large and busy, but never chaotic. There was an order to each day, a rhythm that all respected. Meals were eaten together, prayers said before sunrise and after sunset, and every Sabbath, the family gathered to remember the commandments and the stories of Israel's deliverance. On these quiet evenings as the oil lamps flickered, Jesse would look at his sons and daughters and feel the weight and blessing of all that Ruth had set in motion.
As the years unfolded, David's story wove itself deeply into the tapestry of Israel. His ascent from shepherd to warrior, from fugitive to king, was recounted in songs and tales, not only in Bethlehem but throughout the nation. The home of Jesse, once a humble outpost at the edge of the barley fields, now stood at the center of Israel's history. When David first became king, he did not forget the lessons of his forebears, Ruth's journey, the hard-won peace and love that she and Boaz had built, echoed in his decisions. He sought justice, welcomed strangers, and listened to the voices of those overlooked or oppressed. Many evenings, as David walked the courtyards of his palace, he recalled the quiet strength of his great-grandmother, her resilience, her humility, her courage to start again. Bethlehem, too, transformed. It grew from a small agricultural village into a bustling town. Merchants brought their wares to the market square, artisans opened workshops, and new homes appeared along the hillside. Yet, for all its growth, the town kept the traditions of Ruth and Boaz alive. The harvest feasts remained sacred times for the community to gather, share bread and stories, and give thanks for all they had received. Jesse's descendants became leaders, advisors, and scribes. Some stayed in Bethlehem, overseeing the family lands and helping guide the village as it prospered. Others followed David to Jerusalem, where the palace gardens bloomed with olive and fig trees, their roots a living link to the fields of Bethlehem. David's rule brought both glory and hardship to Israel. He led his people to victory in battle, united the tribes, and established Jerusalem as the capital. He wrote psalms in the quiet hours before dawn, his words capturing sorrow and triumph, repentance and praise. Even as a king, he was never far from the lessons of the fields, the sense of responsibility and mercy Ruth had embodied, the discipline and hope Boaz had shown. The family's story was retold at every milestone, when a child was born, when a son came of age, when harvests failed or flourished. Each time, the elders would recall Ruth's arrival, her uncertainty, her willingness to work, her devotion to Naomi, and how that act of loyalty had turned despair into a lineage of kings. Generations passed, and the land remained bountiful. The olive groves stretched over the hills, the vineyards produced sweet wine, and the barley fields waved in the wind, just as they had in Ruth's day. Jesse's grandchildren became fathers and mothers in their own right, each striving to honor the example set by their ancestors. Sometimes, travelers would come to Bethlehem, seeking the graves of Ruth and Boaz. They would stand quietly in the dappled shade of the olive trees, contemplating how the love and faithfulness of two people had changed the fate of so many. Stories spread from house to house of Ruth's laughter as she gleaned, of Boaz's generosity, of Naomi's return, of the wedding and the birth of Obed, and of the legacy that shaped a kingdom. In David's reign, the memory of his great-grandparents was honored, not only in his own household, but in celebrations throughout the land. Scribes recorded the family's journey in scrolls, teachers told the story to children in every village, and psalmists wove Ruth's example into their poetry. Her courage was remembered in every act of mercy, every gesture of inclusion, every moment when kindness was chosen over fear. David's sons and daughters grew up in a world shaped by their ancestors' legacy. Solomon, David's son by Bathsheba, would one day become king, famed for his wisdom and the splendor of his court. But even as the palace grew grander, the lessons of Bethlehem remained foundational. The court's advisors remembered Ruth's story as a lesson in humility. The queen mothers invoked her name as they taught compassion to their children. Even after David's reign, as the years turned into centuries, the house of Jesse was known as the house of promise. When dark times came, when Israel faced war, exile, or famine, families would gather and tell again the story of Ruth. They spoke of her journey from Moab, of her steadfastness through sorrow, of her hope that never wavered. In this way, her spirit continued to guide, inspire, and sustain. Bethlehem continued to thrive. Markets swelled with new foods and wares. Young couples carved their names into the trunks of ancient olive trees, and the feasts of Israel grew even more joyous. Each year, the family gathered at Ruth's grave, now marked with smooth stones, and surrounded by a small grove. There new generations would hear the story for the first time, and elders would bow their heads in gratitude. The seasons turned, and the descendants of Ruth and Boaz multiplied. They became weavers and priests, farmers and poets, artisans and scribes. Their names were written in the records of Bethlehem, and their deeds were remembered at every gathering. Long after David, the land saw both times of peace and times of trial. Empires rose and fell, but the fields of Bethlehem remained, worked by hands that remembered Ruth's resilience. When the people of Israel were scattered, they carried her story with them, telling it in distant lands and passing it to their children. Ruth became a symbol not only of Israel, but of hope for all who faced loss and longed for home. Through generations, Ruth's lineage was preserved in careful genealogies, her name never forgotten. When prophets spoke of a new king, a Messiah who would come from David's line, families in Bethlehem whispered Ruth's story with renewed wonder, for it was through her faithfulness that the promise would be fulfilled. And so, in every season, in every change, the legacy of Ruth endured, woven into the very soul of a people, cherished in memory, honored in song, and living on in every act of love and courage that followed her footsteps. As the generations unfolded, Ruth's name remained etched in the heart of Bethlehem. The children of Israel weathered the tides of history. Judges came and went, kings rose and fell, and prophets wandered the countryside, crying out for justice and faith. In every era, Ruth's story was told, a story of leaving all behind, of building anew, of faith that blossomed in the most unlikely soil. The family of Jesse, rooted in the legacy of Ruth and Boaz, became known throughout Judah. Their fields, once gleaned by a lonely widow, stretched for miles, their vineyards lush, and their olive groves ancient. Through seasons of plenty and times of want, the descendants of Ruth weathered drought, war, and uncertainty, always gathering at the old stone house to share news, grieve losses, and celebrate the joys of each new birth. The village itself grew and changed. Houses multiplied, new trades appeared, and the market square bustled with color and sound. Yet certain traditions never faded. At the start of each harvest, the elders and the young alike would walk the fields at dawn, offering thanks and remembering Ruth, the woman who had first gleaned there, whose hands had gathered the barley, and whose courage had brought hope to Naomi. When the days grew short and the nights cold, families gathered indoors, telling stories by the light of the hearth. The tale of Ruth was the favorite, how she had come from Moab, how she had worked under the hot sun, how Boaz had shown her unexpected kindness, and how the family had been redeemed. The children listened with wide eyes, imagining the fields as they were in that long-ago time, picturing Ruth's determined walk to Bethlehem, Naomi's tears of sorrow, and then joy, Boaz's generosity, and the wedding feast that had united two destinies. Many generations after David, the people of Israel were scattered by conquerors. Some were taken into exile, forced to leave the land of their ancestors, just as Ruth once had left her own. Even in Babylon by the riverside, the story of Ruth was a comfort to those who longed for home. Mothers whispered it to their children at night, fathers retold it at festival meals, elders recorded it in scrolls, determined that her name should not be forgotten. When the exiles returned, battered but hopeful, to rebuild Jerusalem and the land of Judah, they found the house of Jesse and the fields of Bethlehem still standing. The vineyards were overgrown, and the stones of the old house were cracked. The well still gave water, and the ancient olive trees still bore fruit. Descendants of Ruth's line reclaimed their inheritance, sowed the fields, pruned the vines, and rebuilt the house, once again filling it with laughter, stories, and song. New generations grew up with Ruth's tale as their heritage. The story reminded them that even the greatest loss could become the seed of blessing, that the foreigner and the widow could become the matriarch of a royal line, and that love and loyalty were stronger than despair. As the centuries passed, prophets arose in Israel, speaking of a coming redemption. Isaiah declared that from the stump of Jesse, a shoot would grow, a king whose rule would bring peace and justice to all nations. Micah, a prophet from the countryside, spoke words that sent a quiet thrill through Bethlehem. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. The people of Bethlehem remembered these words. Each year, when pilgrims passed through on their way to Jerusalem, the townsfolk told them of Ruth and Boaz, of David and Jesse, and of the promise that a great king would come from their midst. The house of Jesse, now rebuilt and expanded, was a place of hospitality and learning, where children studied the genealogies and recited the Psalms of David. Ruth's grave, still tended by loving hands, drew visitors who left pebbles and flowers, a silent testimony to the endurance of hope. Time moved onward. Empires changed hands, and foreign soldiers marched through the land, but the people of Bethlehem continued their labors, planting, harvesting, teaching, and remembering. The land passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. In times of hardship, Ruth's story was their anchor. In times of blessing, it was their song of gratitude. One winter, under Roman rule, Bethlehem was crowded with travelers. A census had been decreed, and every descendant of David was required to return to the city of his ancestors. Among those who arrived was a carpenter from Nazareth named Joseph, accompanied by his young wife, Mary. They found the town full, every inn and guest room occupied, but the family of Jesse, now scattered but always generous, found room for them in the shelter where animals were kept. That night, beneath the same stars that had shone on Ruth and Boaz, Mary gave birth to her son. Joseph, tracing his line back to David, Jesse, Obed, and Ruth, looked upon the child and knew the ancient promises were fulfilled. Shepherds came from the hills, drawn by an angel's song, and wise men from the east followed a star to the little town. Bethlehem, once the place where a foreign widow found hope, became the birthplace of hope for all nations.
The family of Ruth, now spread across the land, rejoiced at the news. Word of the child, born in the stable, traveled quickly, and those who remembered the old prophecies realized that Ruth's story had come full circle. Her legacy, carried by Obed, Jesse, and David, had become the root of salvation, a gift to the world. Through the centuries that followed, Ruth's name was cherished in Bethlehem and beyond. Her story was recorded in sacred texts, recited in synagogues, and sung in songs of hope. Children learned of her journey from Moab, her toil in the fields, her marriage to Boaz, and the family she built. Mothers reminded their daughters of her example, and fathers taught their sons the values she embodied: loyalty, kindness, courage, and faith. The fields where Ruth once gleaned became holy ground, remembered by pilgrims and celebrated by poets. The barley and wheat still grew each year, harvested by hands that honored the past. The house of Jesse stood as a symbol of endurance and promise, welcoming the wanderer, the lost, and the hopeful, just as Ruth herself had once been welcomed. Through every season, spring's green renewal, summer's golden bounty, autumn's quiet rest, winter's hush, Ruth's spirit remained, a guiding star for all who sought meaning and belonging. Her journey, begun in sorrow, blossomed into blessing. Her faith, tested by hardship, became the seed of redemption. Her love, once a quiet promise on a lonely road, was fulfilled in the birth of a child who would change the world. And so, in Bethlehem, and wherever her story was told, Ruth was remembered, not only as a Moabite, not only as a gleaner or a bride, but as the mother of kings, the ancestor of hope, the heart of a people who would never forget her name.
The story of Ruth, once told in whispers among family around the hearth, became woven into the very language and customs of Bethlehem. As time passed, children in the village learned to read from scrolls that contained her name. The scribes, working by lamplight in rooms lined with ancient books, copied the Book of Ruth carefully, word by word, ensuring that her journey from Moab to Bethlehem would never be forgotten. During festival days, especially at the time of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, when the first fruits were offered and the giving of the Torah was remembered, the people of Bethlehem read aloud Ruth's story. Crowds would gather in the main square, elders taking turns to recite the tale, their voices carrying over the heads of the assembled villagers and visitors. It was more than a custom. It was a living reminder that kindness to the stranger, loyalty to family, and courage in the face of adversity were not simply virtues, but the foundation of their community. Ruth's descendants, spread now across Israel, would return each year for these celebrations. The home that Boaz and Ruth had built was cared for by generation after generation, its garden always green, its doors always open. Inside, walls were adorned with the tools Ruth had once used, the clay jars she had filled, and the shawl she had worn as she gleaned in the fields. New brides in the family would touch these objects for luck, remembering the woman who had shown that even a foreigner could change the world with faith and perseverance. Throughout the centuries, as Israel's fortunes rose and fell, the legacy of Ruth was a comfort. During times of foreign occupation, when hope seemed lost, families would remind themselves that Ruth had once been an outsider too. Her faith had triumphed over fear, her labor had brought reward, and her line had led to kings. Even in exile, Jewish families around the world told Ruth's story, passing it down in secret when times were dangerous, celebrating it openly when they could. Travelers and scholars came to Bethlehem, some seeking the tombs of the ancestors, others drawn by the legend of a Moabite woman whose choice to follow her heart had reshaped history. Poets from distant lands wrote verses inspired by her loyalty, while rabbis debated the laws of gleaning and redemption, always citing Ruth and Boaz as their foundation. In the evenings, as the sun set over the hills and the sky blazed with crimson and gold, the people of Bethlehem would gather for communal meals. Food was shared with the poor, the lonely and the traveler, just as Ruth had once shared her bread with Naomi. The youngest children were encouraged to serve the guests first, so that generosity became a habit, a tradition and a sacred duty. The story of Ruth became a symbol not only for the family of David, but for anyone who felt like an outsider, anyone who had ever started anew. Her tale was retold to encourage the orphan, the widow, the stranger. It was sung at weddings and whispered at funerals, woven into lullabies and prayers for the journey. As the world changed, empires rising and falling, the people of Israel scattered and returned, new kings and prophets born and lost, the fields of Bethlehem remained. Each spring, the barley sprouted green and fresh. Each summer, the harvest brought crowds to the village. On the paths where Ruth had once walked, young couples strolled hand in hand, old men sat in the shade of the olive trees, and shepherds led their flocks to pasture. Pilgrims from distant lands arrived in Bethlehem, following stories passed down through generations. They stood in awe before the place where Ruth had gleaned, where David had watched his sheep, where kings and poets had been born. Many wept, feeling the weight of history, the presence of a woman whose courage and love had changed the fate of a people. With the coming of the Messiah, the prophecy fulfilled, the story of Ruth reached even further. In distant countries, as the teachings of Jesus spread, his lineage traced back to David, to Jesse, to Obed, and to Ruth. Her name was spoken in new tongues and written in new alphabets, celebrated in churches and homes across continents and centuries. The fields of Bethlehem remained fertile, the olive trees ancient and wise. Each year, as the Feast of Weeks returned, children and elders alike gathered under the stars to hear again the story of Ruth. Her spirit was alive in every act of welcome, every meal shared with a stranger, every step taken in faith. So her legacy continued, not just as the mother of kings, but as the heart of a people, the soul of a land, and a beacon to all who wander, all who hope, and all who believe that a single life, lived with courage and love, can transform the world forever. Generations turned into centuries, and yet the memory of Ruth did not fade. Her descendants settled in many lands, from the sunlit valleys of Galilee to the bustling quarters of Jerusalem, and even far beyond Israel's borders. In every place, the name of Ruth was cherished, spoken in awe as the root of a royal house, and the symbol of a love that defied all boundaries. Scholars debated her story in the great academies of Alexandria and Babylon. Artists painted scenes of her gleaning the barley. Poets wrote verses about her lonely walk on the road to Bethlehem, and scribes illustrated the scroll of her life with intricate borders of wheat and wild flowers. In the synagogues of distant lands, during the festival of Shavuot, her story was read aloud, her words to Naomi echoing in every tongue. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. In Bethlehem, the house of Jesse remained a point of pilgrimage for those seeking connection to Israel's ancient roots. Visitors were guided through the rooms where Ruth had once knelt to grind grain, where she had sung to Obed as a child, where the laughter of her grandchildren had echoed off stone walls. The garden she once tended had grown into a grove, each new tree planted by a different generation, some marked with plaques bearing the names of her descendants: Obed, Jesse, David, Solomon, and beyond. The marketplace of Bethlehem, once a cluster of wooden stalls and cloth awnings, had grown into a thriving hub, but some things never changed. Vendors offered bread still baked from the wheat of Jesse's fields, honey from the same hillside hives, and oil pressed from the ancient olives Ruth herself might have harvested. On festival days, musicians played melodies that, it was said, dated back to David's youth, songs he'd learned at his great-grandmother's knee. Each year, as spring unfolded and the air filled with birdsong, Bethlehem prepared for Shavuot. Homes were swept clean, garlands hung, and tables set for feasting. As dusk fell, the villagers would gather on rooftops or in courtyards, passing around the old family scrolls, reciting the tale of Ruth and Boaz. In every house, candles flickered and faces glowed with pride as the story unfolded, how Ruth, the Moabite, had come as a stranger, but had chosen faith, family, and a new destiny. The youngest children, restless at first, would quiet as the story was told. They would imagine Ruth's arrival on the dusty road, Naomi's weary embrace, the first glimpse of the barley fields, and Boaz's gentle kindness. The girls in the audience dreamed of showing such courage, the boys of offering such protection. Parents whispered to each other that Ruth's heart lived on in the children's curiosity and in the community's ever-open doors. Beyond Bethlehem, Ruth's influence shaped customs and attitudes. The law of gleaning, intended to help the poor and the stranger, was honored with special devotion in her memory. Fields throughout Israel and in Jewish communities abroad were left unharvested at the corners, so that no one, widow, orphan, or sojourner, would go hungry. In every act of charity, her example was present. Her name became a byword for steadfastness. When young couples faced adversity, the elders would remind them, "Love as Ruth loved." When someone new entered the village or community, neighbors would say, "Welcome them as Ruth was welcomed." Her image was carved into city gates, embroidered on ceremonial cloths, and engraved on wedding rings. As faith in the God of Israel spread to distant peoples, Ruth's story crossed borders and languages. In Christian lands, she was honored as the ancestress of Jesus, the gentle mother whose courage and humility had prepared the way for redemption. In the East, her story became a parable of transformation, a model for those who sought to start anew. Centuries later, Bethlehem itself changed hands many times, ruled by kings and emperors, besieged and rebuilt, adorned with churches and shrines. But through it all, the fields remained, and the people kept the memory of Ruth alive. On nights when the moon shone over the barley, it was said that her spirit walked the fields, blessing the harvest, and watching over the descendants she could never have imagined. Visitors from across the world continued to arrive, seeking a glimpse of the landscape where so much history had unfolded. They traced the roads that Ruth and Naomi had walked, touched the stones of the well where she had drawn water, and stood before her grave, reading the ancient inscriptions. Some wept for her sorrow, others rejoiced in her triumph. All were moved by the depth and reach of her legacy. Ruth's descendants remained proud of their origins, holding family reunions that drew cousins from far and wide. Family trees were kept with meticulous care, each new child's name inscribed alongside the long line that began with Ruth and Boaz. At weddings, the bride and groom would hear the charge to build their household as Ruth had, on kindness, faithfulness, and the welcoming of strangers. And so, even as the world changed, cities rising and falling, new empires stretching across the earth, the heart of Ruth's story endured. Her journey from Moab to Bethlehem was retold in every age, teaching each generation that courage, loyalty, and love could transform fate, that a single life,
lived with intention, could ripple outward and shape the destiny of nations. In Bethlehem, the children ran laughing through the fields, unaware that their games echoed a story older than the stones beneath their feet. Elders tended the olive trees planted in Ruth's honor, whispering her name as the breeze rustled through the leaves. And families gathered under the same stars that had watched over Ruth so long ago, recited her words, sharing in the unending circle of memory and hope. Thus from the barley fields of Bethlehem, through the courts of kings, the exiles' camps, the streets of distant cities, and the homes of strangers, Ruth's legacy lived on, undimmed by time, unbroken by distance, eternal in the hearts of all who cherished the story of love's enduring power.
The centuries did not dim the light of Ruth's legacy. In lands both near and far, among peoples speaking different tongues, the story of Ruth was told and retold. It became a tale not only of faith and family, but of belonging, renewal, and the power of choice to create a future from the ashes of the past. Ruth's name was spoken at the hearths of Jewish families in every part of the world, from the cities along the Mediterranean to the remote villages of Persia, from the bustling markets of North Africa to the quiet hamlets of Europe. Her story was found in the Torah scrolls and in the hearts of those who felt themselves to be wanderers, strangers, or seekers of hope. In every generation, young women looked to Ruth as an example of strength. When life brought them to crossroads, when families were uprooted, or when hope was scarce, the image of Ruth on the road to Bethlehem, her face turned toward an uncertain future, her hand clasping Naomi's, was a reminder that even the most difficult choices could bear fruit and blessing. Poets across cultures drew inspiration from Ruth's unwavering devotion. They imagined her prayers in the fields, her secret dreams as she gathered grain, the quiet pride she must have felt as she watched her family grow. Painters depicted her in every style and age, a lone figure silhouetted against golden barley, or embraced by Naomi under the Bethlehem sky. Musicians composed melodies that carried her longing and her triumph, their songs drifting from synagogues to churches, from the hills of Judea to the concert halls of the world. In the Christian faith, Ruth's story was woven into the lineage of redemption. Her inclusion in the genealogy of Jesus, written in the Gospels, gave hope to millions that no one was beyond God's embrace. She was cited in sermons and prayers as a symbol that faith could transcend bloodlines and nations, and that love was the true inheritance of all people. Her story was read in the early morning hours of Pentecost in countless churches, connecting the faithful across continents and centuries to the fields of ancient Bethlehem. Even outside the Abrahamic faiths, Ruth became a universal emblem. Her courage and loyalty were themes in folk tales, her journey a symbol for all who dared to seek a new beginning. In literature, her image graced the pages of novels and histories, her life the touchstone for stories of migration, endurance, and found family. In modern times, Ruth's name was chosen by charitable organizations and shelters, a promise that anyone, however lost or far from home, could find belonging and purpose. In Bethlehem itself, time brought changes. Empires came and went, buildings crumbled and were rebuilt, languages and rulers shifted like the wind. Yet, each year the people still gathered at Ruth's resting place. They tidied her grave, laid fresh olive branches and wild flowers, and remembered her journey from exile to acceptance, from sorrow to joy. The field where Ruth had gleaned was preserved as a place of memory. Pilgrims walked its paths, pausing to pick a handful of barley as she once did, imagining the strength required to start anew in a strange land. Guides told her story in every language, pointing out the landmarks, the well where she drew water, the threshing floor where her destiny changed, the home she built with Boaz and filled with generations of laughter and song. The traditions Ruth inspired lived on in countless ways. During the Feast of Weeks, Jewish families across the globe set aside part of their table for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, echoing the laws of gleaning that Ruth's story made sacred. Weddings featured readings from her book, with brides vowing loyalty and courage in her words. Children dressed as Ruth in school plays, reenacting her journey and celebrating the triumph of love over adversity. As the centuries gave way to modernity, Ruth's descendants spread across the world. Some became leaders and teachers, others artists and builders, but all carried with them the inheritance of her name. In Israel, Bethlehem remained a touchstone, and in every synagogue, church and home where her story was read, Ruth was alive in the hopes, choices and kindness of the people. On quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the olive trees and the moon cast silver shadows over the barley fields, it was said that Ruth's spirit could be felt by those who listened. Her life, rooted in the soil of a distant land, blossomed into a tree whose branches sheltered countless souls, whose fruit nourished the weary, whose legacy would never wither. Ruth was no longer just a Moabite or a widow, no longer only the mother of Obed or the ancestor of David. She became, through her story, a beacon of what was possible for anyone who chose hope over fear, faith over despair, and love over isolation. In every age, in every tongue, Ruth's story continued, a testament to what one life, bravely lived, can mean for the whole world. As the world turned into a new millennium, the story of Ruth was as alive as ever. In cities and villages far from the hills of Bethlehem, people still gathered to share her tale. New translations of her book appeared, written in dozens of languages, printed on fine parchment for synagogues, on gilded pages for cathedrals, on pocket-sized paperbacks for students and travelers. Wherever stories were valued, Ruth stood near the top, its message as clear and as gentle as the day she first pledged herself to Naomi on that lonely road. In Bethlehem, change came with each passing era. Pilgrims arrived, not only from Judea but from every nation, drawn by the promise that here, a foreigner's faith had blossomed into the root of a king, a prophet, a Messiah. The fields where Ruth had gleaned became a protected heritage site. Schools were built where children recited her words, and museums displayed pottery and tools unearthed from the land she once tilled. On festival nights, thousands of lights glowed across the town as families gathered to celebrate, just as Ruth and Naomi once had. Modern farmers brought the first sheaves of wheat to the synagogue. Children dressed in white paraded through the streets, singing old songs about harvest and hope. In homes from Tel Aviv to Toronto, from Cape Town to Shanghai, Ruth's story was read at the family table, a quiet link connecting those around the world with those who had come before. In universities, scholars studied Ruth's story for its literary beauty, its legal insight, and its enduring emotional resonance. She became the subject of doctoral theses, theatrical productions, paintings, films, and even children's cartoons. Archaeologists traced her footsteps in the soil of ancient Israel, piecing together the lives of ordinary people whose choices had changed the world. For many, Ruth became a symbol of migration, of forging identity in a new place. In bustling city neighborhoods filled with families from every corner of the globe, social workers and teachers used her example to inspire children who felt caught between cultures, reminding them that belonging could be made and family chosen, no matter where you started. In fields of barley and wheat across continents, the memory of Ruth guided hands young and old. The gleaner's right, her legal protection, was invoked in new laws to safeguard the poor and hungry. Her legacy shaped charitable work and social justice. Her story called out in moments of struggle to welcome the stranger, feed the hungry, show compassion to the widow, and trust in the possibility of redemption for every soul. Within the family of David, now scattered and multiplied beyond counting, Ruth's name appeared in genealogies and birth announcements. Grandparents told their grandchildren that they were descended from kings and from a woman who had crossed borders, braved famine, and chosen hope. At weddings, at coming-of-age ceremonies, at funerals and festivals, her memory was invoked as a blessing. May you have the courage of Ruth. May your home be as full of laughter as hers. May you find your place in the world and make it a home for others. When Christians told the story of Christmas, they honored Ruth as the mother of the line that brought Jesus into the world. In Advent readings and nativity plays, her name was spoken with awe. In churches and cathedrals, her story was carved in stone and painted in glass, a testimony to the idea that God's greatest works sometimes begin with the quiet courage of a single heart. In times of turmoil, Ruth's words offered reassurance. In times of joy, her example offered guidance. She was no longer only a figure of the past, but a presence in the everyday lives of those who claimed her story as their own. She became the guardian of wanderers, the patron of second chances, the face of compassion in every age. As long as families gathered to share meals, as long as harvests were brought in from the fields, as long as the vulnerable were remembered and welcomed, Ruth's journey continued. Her story echoed in the voices of teachers and children, in the halls of learning and the quiet moments of prayer, in the song of the land and the laughter around every table. The cycle of her life, from sorrow to hope, from exile to belonging, from ordinary days to eternal legacy, is woven into the fabric of humanity. And so, the story goes on, as long as people seek love, as long as they dream of a better home, as long as they choose faith over fear, Ruth walks beside them, her spirit in the golden fields, her courage in their hearts, her name never forgotten. And the world remembers her, not only as the great-grandmother of kings, not only as the mother of a people, but as the quiet, steadfast soul who changed everything simply by choosing love. Even in the modern age, the legacy of Ruth pulses quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life. In far-off cities, among glass towers and busy avenues, her name finds its way into conversation, literature, and art. A charity for mothers and children, a field set aside for the hungry, a home that welcomes the lonely, all borrow her example, whether those who build them know it or not. Ruth's fields, though separated now by centuries and borders, are everywhere that people gather grain, tend gardens, or care for their neighbors. In places where the seasons turn in silence, and in cities alive with 1,000 languages, her spirit is present wherever hope begins anew. Her story is told by candlelight in mountain villages, recited in the glow of electric screens, retold in classrooms, and whispered between friends who promise to stand by each other through life's darkest valleys. For artists and dreamers, Ruth is a muse, the picture of courage as she steps across an unknown border, of tenderness as she leans close to comfort, Naomi of humility and resolve as she bends to gather the gleanings left behind. For those who wander, her journey offers a map. Every exile contains a thread of home, every stranger a future friend, every act of faith the seed of a harvest yet unseen. On farms from South America to Africa, from Australia to the Ukrainian plains, the story of Ruth is echoed when harvests are shared, when fields are left open to the needy, when kindness is counted as a crop more valuable than any other. In synagogues and churches, in mosques and community halls, her example crosses barriers, speaking to the best in all people, the willingness to risk, to serve, to trust. For every child who feels out of place, for every family who starts over in a new country, for every widow or orphan or soul who wonders if there is a future, Ruth's footsteps lead the way. The memory of her vow, "Where you go, I will go, your people will be my people," is repeated in 1,000 tongues, in moments of joining, of parting, of hope. Time has not diminished her story, rather each new telling enriches it. In novels and songs, in paintings and plays, her legacy evolves, adapting to new needs, inspiring new generations. Sometimes she is the central figure, sometimes only a name whispered in the background, but always her presence lingers, steadfast, gentle, guiding. In Bethlehem, as evening falls, the hills grow quiet, but the pulse of Ruth's story continues. Local children, playing hide and seek among olive trees, laugh and call each other's names, perhaps not realizing that their games are woven from the same fabric as Ruth's courage and Naomi's hope. Farmers return home with the day's work done, as Ruth and Boaz once did, grateful for the land's bounty and the warmth of family. And every so often, in quiet moments, when the moonlight touches the fields and the world holds its breath, someone, perhaps a grandmother telling a bedtime story, a father comforting his child, a stranger far from home, recalls Ruth's journey. Her presence is felt in the hush between words, in the promise of a better tomorrow, in the gentle certainty that one life, lived with love, can transform everything. Thus the story of Ruth lives on, not merely as history, nor even as legend, but as a living inheritance. In every act of compassion, in every bold choice to love, in every harvest shared with a stranger, she is there, the quiet gleaner, the brave traveler, the mother of a line that changed the world. And so, with each telling, the circle widens, the fields grow greener, the night yields to dawn, and Ruth's name remains, a song of belonging, a story of hope, a promise that endures through all the ages.